Hey there, friends. How are you doing? It's Tuesday night. I am in the throes of a cold, but I'm bored, so I thought I would go through and do this, and hopefully I've gotten myself, sedated enough that you won't hear me cough. So let's start our walkthrough of the majors together. Why not? I think I made this a little bit more complicated for myself than I needed to. Instead of using the same four decks I've been using, I decided to go through and pull the major arcana from the Waitsmith, but then also from a number of other decks that I've got lying around. Some that I use and love, and some that I love and don't use, but all of which I think are really beautiful. And so what I wanted to do was kind of bring out what I thought were the truest or most interesting or the versions that taught me about the cards. So that's not it actually wound up being more difficult than I thought to find sort of the cards I wanted to really encapsulate the picture. And it was interesting too because there are some versions of the card where I think the Waitsmith is so perfect that it's hard for me to find others that hold a candle to it, and then there are others where there are so many that I love. So this was an interesting experiment, and it's not. I wasn't sort of consistent all the way through. You know what I mean? I didn't say, well, I have to have 5 versions of each card. I just sort of went through the same stack of decks. And there was one deck that I went through that I used to use like almost exclusively. And I didn't pull a single card from it at all. So I thought that was interesting too. So anyway, the decks that I have, well, you'll see them as I go along. So let's just start right in with the Fool. And I'm going to try to do this in a way that makes it easy to see. So as I mentioned, for each of the majors, I chose the Waitsmith and others. So this is a card where I think I've talked about this before. Like the Fool frequently actually disappoints me in decks, and that may be because good old Pamela just did it. You know what I mean? Sometimes they just do it. Although I'll say I haven't really worked with the Line Strider much. I have a hard time reading with it for some reason, but can you see that? It's not finished being drawn. Gosh, brilliant, right? Oh my god, so smart. This is a deck I need to put more of an investment in. This is the Fountain Tarot. This is the Margaret Peterson. This is the Ellis. This is the Line Strider, and of course, this is Rider-Waite. This is my very first deck. I don't know if you can tell, but it actually got wet over the years, and so it's kind of like bowed. But I thought I would pull it out for this. I remember going through this is the purple box version of the Rider-Waite Smith, and everyone hates it. I love it, but it was my first, it was my first love. I remember going through the cards for the first time and just like that feeling, of seeing each card is so cool. The Fool is one of my favorite cards, because there's like an innocence and you know what, before I get into that, I guess I should, I'm sorry. I'm even more scattered than usual. The majors, right, or the trumps or the keys, I flat out refuse to call them the trumps anymore because that word has been skunked for me, but whatever. The keys. I actually really like using the word keys for major arcana. I think that's interesting. This is a little Western centric of me to say, but I feel like the majors or the keys are the kind of life moments that everybody goes through in our world, at least in this this part of the world where tarot is of interest to people. We have universal experiences as we go through life, and the keys explore that. And they're not, there are times where you read them like an everyday thing, but they are the larger than life moments that shape us, as opposed to the pips, which are the things that we experience and happen. We could in a way go through all 56 of the pips on any given day, but it's unlikely we'd go through all 22 of the keys in a given day. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's something larger about them. So when I think about them, I think about our spiritual journey, our spiritual path. I've really, I hate using the word spiritual because I don't know how to define it. But one of the benefits of using it is it feels kind of universal, and that anyone can assign whatever they want to that word. Soul, higher self. You know, as a language person, one of the places where I fall down is trying to find the perfect word for things, and that's not great. They are archetypes. They're aspects of our larger world, or our universal experiences, or our universal traits. I think one of the things about the keys is that when we see them, we kind of immediately know who they are or what they are. We kind of know that experience even without reading them. And I've been doing a lot of reading lately about the history of tarot, and I have a couple books on the way, and I'm reading this one, which is in really rough shape. I bought it used, and boy, is it ever. I hope whoever got this, who had this before me, loves it, because, gosh, it's in rough shape. But this is the Tarot History, Mystery, and Lore by Cynthia Giles. And it's been really worth just, I don't know, exploring back to those initial stirrings of tarot and whatnot. I think that where I was going with that is, we know that the tarot wasn't used for spiritual purposes or divination purposes when it was created. You know, we know that that's true now. But what the cards came out of, and the keys in particular, are like recognizable things, whether they were just, you know, virtues or follies, whether they were floats in a parade, which, you know, is a lore that, again, now pretty much known to be untrue. Whatever they were, like, I think one of the reasons why they exist at all is because they're so universal to Europeanized worlds. And I'm saying that partly because, you know, the world is such a product of colonialism, but also I don't think that the experiences, the way they're pictured, are universal. Although humanity may have, in all its various cultures and parts of the world, experiences like these, they probably would give them different language and different glyphs, you know, as they go through. But there is a broadness. There's a shared experience in these cards. So that's how I think about them. In a reading, I tend to think about them as big exclamation points. They're things that I really need to pay attention to. They're signposts on my life journey. They're the benchmarks or the road signs that point me, or who I'm reading for, toward things that I need to really pay attention to. Things that are going to help me in my development, or that are part of my overall development. And beyond that, I try not to think too much about how large they are, because then it gets intimidating. So I kind of imagine a big exclamation point, or a big, you know, sort of neon glow coming out of the keys when I see them in a reading, and I say, okay, pay attention to that. And then I try to ignore that and just say, okay, I need to pay attention to that. I'm going to, now let me just relax into the reading and go. So anyway, yeah, I think one of the reasons why, when majors come up in readings, it's hard for even experienced readers to kind of define them well, is because they are slightly ineffable, and the experiences they describe are slightly ineffable, and that's kind of good. You know, there are moments that I'm going to quote a theater piece again. There's a line in Hamilton, you know, big Broadway hit right now. There are moments that the words don't reach. And I feel like sometimes it's important that we try not to. You know, it's important that we try not to put into words those things that are too big, because it makes them smaller. And I say that as someone who loves language and writing. So one of the reasons why it can be hard to describe what these cards mean in readings is that they are so big. And so one of the things that you can do when you're having trouble putting them into words, if you have someone sitting next to you, is to show them, and have them tell you. And I should do that more. And I don't. But anyway, so the majors, the keys. So the Fool is to me, it's funny now that I'm going to go into all that loftiness, and then I'm going to use very banal language to describe these cards, which again is one of the interesting things about what we do, right? Because I've spent 10 minutes not even talking about the Fool. All right, so the Fool in its best sense is adventurousness. It's new beginnings. It's an explosion of energy. It's full steam ahead. It's open. I once heard, I think it was Avalon on her channel, spirit in search of experience, is a phrase that I think she used, and I just loved that. It's carefree, it's fresh, it's rough and ready, it's innocent, and it's new, and it's just the potential. It's almost like if all four aces got together and had a baby. That would be the Fool. Except the aces can't have a baby because they, like the Fool, are unformed potential. But there's this dawn of potential, this sort of inkling of potential that I love about the Fool. And just carefree and joyous and like, fuck yeah, let's do this. You know what I mean? Like, there's just a carelessness, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but I think one of the reasons why I love this card so much is that the Fool does not suffer from anxiety. Which is the opposite of me. The Fool does not think about consequences. The Fool does not spend years planning. He does not spend years fantasizing. He just does. He just is pure impulse. And again, I want to highlight that I'm using the pronoun he in this case, just because it's easy to reach for, not because I think the Fool represents maleness. In fact, it doesn't represent male or femaleness. It represents something before male and female. And as we get into the keys, we do start to break into male and female, because we get the magician and the high priestess, we get the emperor and the empress, and then we come back together in the world as hermaphrodite or androgyne, as the reunification of male and female. So there's a connectedness there, but the Fool doesn't have that. The Fool is pre-gendered. It does not have, it's not cisgendered, it's not transgendered, it's not gendered. The Fool exists before gender. So now the shadow side of that is carelessness, ignorance, thoughtlessness, rootlessness, commitment phobicness, nebulousness. I use that word a lot, and it's kind of nebulous is kind of a nebulous word, but it's like cloudy and unformed and ethereal and not easy to detect and not easy to describe and not easy to work with. It's someone who is difficult to connect with. It's someone who's difficult to engage with, who can't sit still, who's like a rambling man. So if the Fool ends up being around or central to a relationship reading, this is probably a person who can't commit. Not because they're bad or they hate you or whatever, they are just too unformed yet, to settle. So I don't generally read the Fool in a negative way, because again, I think the Fool predates or presupposes or exists before negative and positive. It just is. The way we experience it is negative and positive because we don't exist in that unformed world. But the Fool does, So the Fool, may do thoughtless things that may hurt you, but it's not because they're bad. It's because they don't have a concept of hurt. They're the baby that hasn't touched the stove yet. That's the Fool. Yeah, I don't think anybody did it better than Pamela Coleman Smith. I really don't. And all of the cards here kind of show that. I really picked cards that show a Pamela Coleman Smith-ishness. This is the Marguerite Peterson deck, or Margareta Peterson. I'm going to get really close here. I really do love this one. This is such a large card, and I don't speak German, and so I don't know all the card names, and even the numbers aren't digits or numerals, they're words. So I don't read this. I know there's an English version, but I actually haven't bothered to get it because I don't use the German one. And I actually don't like the English titles on some of the cards on this deck. So anyway, I'm really sort of blown away by the Line Strider, though. This sort of unfinished drawing. Brilliant. Brilliant, brilliant. So there's our Fool. So next up is the Magician. I'm going to get those cards out. One of the weird things I had anxiety sort of putting out the cards that I was going to use for this, because I hate taking cards away from their decks. In those books where they say, carry the card around with you for a day. I'm like, no, it'll be separated from the rest of the deck. Like, what if something happens to it? I have a weird thing with my decks where I don't like them to be separated. So you can't see it, but next to me there's a giant pile of crap and decks. The Magician, I only picked 3 cards from because they are pretty consistent. And again, I don't think anyone did it than Pamela Coleman Smith. The Magician is another one of those cards that I adore. The Magician card in the Pamela Coleman Smith, I think, is synonymous to tarot for me because, it's on the cover of the yellow box. I also chose the Magician from the Robin Wood, honestly, because he's hot. And then the Magician from the Raven's Prophecy, because in the simplicity of this, for me, is everything. I really, really like a lot of the art in the Raven's Prophecy deck, and I trimmed it, as I talked about before, and I'm glad I did. I gotta be honest. It was a pain in the neck. That's not what we're talking about here, though, but it's hard for me not to digress. I love the Magician. I have used this metaphor many, many, many times. In part, it comes from a book that Rachel Pollack wrote, and I cannot remember which one. And she may have talked about this in several. But one of the things she talks about is standing in the pose that the Magician stands in. And this idea of as above, so below, and these esoteric terms that we kind of hear, but I don't fully understand because I don't have that background. But what I do think about is this idea of an electrical transformer. And what the Magician does in life is he allows himself to become a transformer. He allows himself to become a router, to use a modern analogy, right? He absorbed. This is probably not a great analogy because I don't know how the internet works, right? Or how wireless internet works. But he makes the wireless internet possible. He takes the wild energy that gets pumped out of the power plant, and he's the transformer, and he makes it usable, and he conducts the energy from the universe into our lives and makes it usable. Otherwise, we would get electrocuted. That's what the Magician does. The Magician is a conduit. If you've ever had an experience when you're working, whatever your work is, if you're a baker or working in a factory or a writer or a parent or whatever, and there, regardless of what you're doing, there will come moments in your life where while you're working, you disappear into the work and become part of it. You become one with what you're doing, and you're not conscious of it fully. You're just doing it, and it's not going through the motions. You become a pure expression of it. You become part of the machine in a good way, the universal machine, the energetic machine, and your inner critic, your inner editor, all those people in your life who told you you couldn't or wouldn't, all of those voices go away, and everything is cooking, and you're firing on all cylinders. And then you look back and you're like, oh my God, like an hour passed. That's the Magician, when we become a conduit for whatever we're doing. The Magician opens himself up, transforms diffuse, maybe overpowering energy into usable force, and makes it into physical reality. And so I love the Magician. And I feel very passionate about that experience because I felt it in many times in my life. And we're really lucky when we do. And I think that is a universal experience for many, many of us. So in that way, he is a conduit, a channeler. Other things I have in my journal include things like a master of creation, a spiritual father, a guru, an enlightened leader, a master, a healer, a shaman, directed energy. But all of that is, those are just words. The magician is experience. The pure sort of potential of the fool manifests into a physical form in the magician. Um, Zero becomes one. Nothingness becomes something. Um, I don't know. So again, really powerful. Now in his shadow station, or his shadow lights, that can be erratic or misdirected energy, misdirected goals. It can be pent up energy, dangerous energy, undirected energy. Um, it could be unmotivated. It could be someone who's a sham or a shyster. Um, but I've talked about this before too, but I think panic attacks, if you've ever had one, are in a way energy that doesn't have an outlet. The magician reversed is that energy that is pent up and doesn't have an outlet. So, oh my god, I've done 2 cards and we're 20 minutes in. You guys are never going to watch this. Let's talk about the High Priestess. The High Priestess is a card that I have frequently struggled reading. And oddly, I picked many cards. I picked a lot of iterations of the High Priestess. If I put the yes, for this display, this array. Partly because I'm always looking at the card index to sort of make it make sense to me. So this is the Tarot of Trees, Prisma Visions, Ellis, Shadowscapes, Raven's Prophecy again, and Wild Unknown. I really like how the Raven's Prophecy Tarot did what they did. I think that even without describing how I feel about the card, this does a pretty ingenious job of taking the High Priestess in a new direction. One of the reasons why I think the High Priestess is so hard to read, and has been, in my opinion, for so many years, is that the idea of the High Priestess is hard to read. She is difficult to read, and is mysterious, and so that makes it difficult to make sense in a reading. But we need to, right? So in the High Priestess, excuse me, I really do have fairly traditional meanings for her. Secrets, the door to secrets. She's the keeper of secrets. She's the sacred feminine. She holds the key. She represents kind of the enticing element of spirituality. She represents leadership, a spiritual mother. She might be a midwife. She's definitely water. She's a natural flow of energy as opposed to the magician's directed flow of energy. She may also represent a secret group or team. But you need to be ready for what she has. You know what I mean? And you need to know how to talk to her in order to draw the curtain back. And that's why when the High Priestess shows up in a reading, I often wonder whether I can't easily interpret it, in part because the person who is getting the reading, even if that's me, isn't super ready to hear the message. So that's part of the High Priestess, I think. The other part of the High Priestess is that she shifts and she changes. And so because she is so watery, I think from a practical standpoint, what the priestess is suggesting in a reading will depend a lot on the context of the cards. If the cards around her are very rigid, she's going to flow through that path. If she's around a lot of diffuse cards, she'll kind of flood the reading the way that water does. Water goes where it can. So the priestess is that way. And again, that makes it difficult for her to always make sense. Another reason why I think she's hard to read is because we've done a really good job in human history of negating the woman and the female in religious practices. And so we don't necessarily know how to read the High Priestess because we don't have the experience of the High Priestess. We know the hierophant, we know the magician. Many of us in life have not had the experience of the High Priestess. but where the magician, as I talked about earlier, represents becoming a conduit and sort of stepping out of the process and becoming one with the process. The priestess is the process. She is the flow of energy. And in a way, the priest and the priestess, or the magician and the priestess, need each other, because without energy, the magician can't make magic, and without direction, the priestess will float everywhere. You know what I mean? So they complement each other. And in that regards, when they show up together, I think, there's definitely a good sense of really abundant creativity, whether we're talking about like literal creativity or spiritual creativity or whatever it may be. Now, the shadow side of the high priestess is, it's keeping people out for power's sake. It's kind of dangling the keys or dangling the carrot, a stick in a carrot. It could be using seduction to wound, using spirituality to control. It could be a pent up natural resource or misdirected use of natural resources. It could be fracking, say. Yeah, so that's the priestess. I'm going to try to pick up my pace here so that you don't get completely bored. Let's now look at the Empress, one of my favorite cards. I have been out in nature, out in the world, and had the experience of feeling the Empress, and seeing these trees in the background. I don't know what kind of trees they are. I can't remember, but so this is, again, Wild Unknown, Tarot of the Trees. I don't know the name of this deck. This is a Dutch ripoff-ish of the Rider-Waite-Smith that I got a long time ago, and I just kind of liked the back. And I liked that the color was richer than Rider-Waite, although it's still not Rider-Waite-Smith. And then this is obviously Rider-Waite-Smith and the Raven's Prophecy. The Empress is one of my favorite cards. I think I remember seeing her for the first time in a book, and just there was something about the artwork, and obviously it was this one, and it just it was breathtaking. I couldn't I don't know, I just couldn't take my eyes off her. Everyone knows that she represents fertility and fecundity. She is a receptive spirit. She's soil, she's earth, she's ripeness, she's mother earth. She's Earth Mother, planet Earth. There's pregnancy possibility. There's also a period of gestation. So it's, where the High Priestess just moves and the Magician's all electric. The Empress isn't as fast moving. You know what I mean? There's a gestation period. She's pregnancy. She doesn't just portend pregnancy, but she is pregnancy. She's a cycle of growing prior to birth. She is a period of growth. It's that period of planting. It's the movement of spring, winter into spring, sort of those early to mid days of spring, freshness and nature and bees. You know what I mean? She's all of those things. And again, I think in a reading, it's sort of when she's in a reading, there's sort of a rich soil. It's like a good time to plant. It's a good time to start projects. It's a good time to initiate things, knowing that it's going to take time for them to grow and develop and become. It takes 9 months for a human child to grow and be ready to born. So, it's going to take time for this project, but it's a good time to plant those seeds. It's a good time to kind of step back in the way that the Seven of Pentacles asks us to step back and see what we've got so far. So you've got that energy there. And if you saw the Empress with the Seven of Pentacles, it might be like a really good time to pause and see the big picture. In her shadow aspect, there's a barrenness. There's something that's not ripe yet, or not allowing ourselves to take time to let things gestate, not growing, storms, seeds that won't for fertilize or sprout. Flowers that won't pollinate. It's something picked before it's ripe. There's sort of an assault on something like that in that case. So there's definitely a little bit of violence in that. There can be a block. Um, yeah, there can be just sort of an inability to let things grow. So that's the Empress. And the Emperor is another card for me, like the High Priestess, that has always been not my favorite to see in a reading, because he is in his way standoffish. I The reason I pulled the Wild Unknown is because I really like the way that Kim Krans creates a partnership between the Empress and the Emperor in her deck. It really unites them in a cool way. So again, Ellis, Line Strider, Shadowscapes, Fountain, Wild Unknown. There's a harshness to the Emperor. There's a stereotype of of mother and father with the Emperor and the Empress, and where there's gentleness and nurture. With the Empress, there's like war and there's rigidity and heat with the Emperor. It's a much drier card. It's a much more arid card, and so he can be hard to get to know, and because of that, he can be hard to learn the meanings of. The Japaridzi deck, which I don't have, calls this card War, and that's actually one of the reasons why I'm not super drawn to that deck or buying it. But where the priestess is receptive energy, of course. Here we get into gender archetypes. He's a fertilizer. He's a projecting energy. So there's fertilization, there's inception, command, power, there's roughness, there's sort of dust and dirt, spareness, asceticism, sort of simplicity. It's active. It makes things happen. It's very, it's necessary roughness, so to speak. So there is a very gruff maleness, archetypal maleness to the Emperor, and if he shows up in a reading, he can suggest someone who is difficult to get to know. He can also request. He can represent a need for discipline, or an interest in discipline, or that influence being important, and you can take that however you want to, whether it's sort of family or sex even. He doesn't fuck around in that way. He's who he is. He's what he is, and he's not necessarily interested in changing that about himself. It's gotten him this far. There's an age and a sort of wizened quality to him, and all of those are kind of the good things. The negative ones are like drought, cruelty, nastiness, abuse, unnecessary roughness, to take that metaphor further, a lack of command, a weakness, a lack of power, inaction, meanness, abuse of power, abuse of position. So he really can be nasty in a shadow aspect because his good qualities are so rough. You know what I mean? So he's an interesting cat that way, and he's not easy to have around, but he's attractive in many ways because he does represent a certain kind of power that we are drawn to, male or female. I don't mean sexually attractive, although it could be that. If he shows up in a love reading, he may be someone who is either gruff and hard to get close to, or someone who likes to sort of make it rough, so to speak. He has a lot in common with the suit of swords, so there's a cerebralness to him. There's this relationship between the Emperor and the cube, the kind of cube of space, and in a way he kind of is the first card that gives shape to anything. And I think that there is one thing about the emperor that's important that many of us who kind of resist his energy need to remember is that boundaries are good, and the emperor who's ruling over a land is concerned with boundaries. An emperor may be concerned with more boundaries on a map, but there's rule of law, there's rule. So where the magician, the high priestess, and the empress, there's like a carefree quality to them. The emperor comes along and says, no, you can only flow between these narrow parameters. And it's like the parent who tells us we can't ride our bike beyond the driveway in that way, because he knows that there's stuff out there that can hurt us. So he's the first time we meet rules. He's the first time we meet expectations, but he's also the first time we meet someone who can protect us from anything, because he does recognize that there's danger in the world. He does recognize that it's not, the fool's energy gone unchecked. The fool would die, without the emperor's rigidity to come along and say, no, you got to play in the yard. You got to stay inside the fence. You can't talk to strangers. You can't take, candy from a stranger. Don't go into that guy's van. He may be rough. He may be gruff. He may like it rough, so to speak. But he's also not going to let us get killed. He's not going to let us get hurt, because he knows the enemy. He knows what's out there. And so in that way, he's a really interesting card. And there's an eternal quality to him because of the rock, or, the evergreen in the wild unknown, or whatever. He's not a perishable commodity. There may be a drought, but he's still surviving. So, the rest of the cards don't have that. This is the first time we also get that quality. So there's the emperor. So now the hierophant, another card that I a lot of us who came up through traditional organized religion may have had an aversion to this guy. Can you see all those? Yes. Because like the magician, he's not like the magician, like the emperor, he sort of has a quality rebellious spirits don't like. I've come around on him, though, partly because of artists who have gone beyond the Pope quality. Even so, again, Wild Unknown, Shadowscapes, Waite Smith, Raven's Prophecy, Line Strider, Ellis, Fountain Tarot, Prism. Let me move this one over because glossy cards look pretty. It's sort of, anyway. The Shadowscapes is always hard to see. So there is a religious aspect to this card, and there's an institutionalism to this card that a lot of us don't like. But again, coming out of the Emperor, we are now in a world of rules. We're now in a world of boundaries and parameters. So, in the evolution of humanity, in the first 5 cards, we kind of get the organization of humanity, you know what I mean? The spark of creation in the Fool, the learning, of humanity to live in the world with the combination of the magician and the high priestess, birth and order in the empress and the emperor. But up until this point, anyone's been able to religiously think whatever they want. The Hierophant comes along and says, here's how faith works. Here are the rules. Here's the rules of faith. Here is what you need to believe in order to ascend to the heights. And in that way, he's a frustrating card because he's not necessarily right. But one of the things that magicians, oh my God, can you tell that I'm not feeling well? No, probably not, because I never make any sense. One of the things that the priest or the Hierophant or the Pope does is he has confidence, and he gives us hope. Anyone who's had a religious experience where they actually lost their faith, knows what it's like to have been brought up in a faith and sort of believe in heaven and believe in all these things, and then to suddenly feel like, oh God, that's gone, is scary. You know, because we lose hope, we lose the idea that everything happens for a reason. You know what I mean? So the Hierophant is there prior to that, saying everything does happen for a reason. Look at all this great stuff. So he makes living in the world bearable, because whether or not he's right, he makes sense of things for us, because he's thought about them on a more on a deeper level than we've had time to, because we've been too busy surviving. So the Hierophant in that way is a good guy, so to speak. You know, he's useful. He is a good guide. So he can represent tradition. He can represent being part of something larger than ourselves. He can represent a guru or a master of art or an organization, an elected official, someone or something who's a spiritual voice or a spiritual guide, who has a certain confidence and kind of a certain rigidity of spirit, that allows him to think that he can do that. You know, the Ellis Tarot takes us into a more yogic guru quality than the priest, but you know, he's still saying, I know things you don't, which which ties him to the high priestess, because she says that too, but she's actually saying, like, talk to me the right way and I'll let you in. The Hierophant saying the only way in is through me. You need to get my permission. So he's more rigid than the high priestess, and in that way he's like an institution. You know, where the high priestess is sort of like, yeah, I'll tell you. You just got to be ready, and you got to say the right things to me. The Hierophant is like, I am the entry point. You can't see what's behind this curtain. You can't see what's behind me, but I'll tell you because I know and I've been there. You know what I mean? So in that way, he's kind of a barrier. And that can also mean that we are sublimating ourselves or being subservient to a cause or a guru, or we're stuck in a passive position to someone else. It can also represent a resistance to intuitions or institutions. Did I say intuitions? Resisting institutions or institutions that have been bad to us, a false prophet, a false leader, a crooked organization, a crooked election, or official. It can represent being blocked from an institution we want to be part of, or it could represent spiritual manipulation. So, a snake oil salesman, a Mount Bank, something like that. I like the way that the Fountain Tarot handles him, because they really feel about him as tradition and sort of holding the key to tradition, and he has this sort of sparkling light-filled box that sort of shows us the past and everything that's come before us, and I think that's really interesting. And then in the Prisma Visions Tarot, I don't know if you can quite see that, but he becomes sort of a constellation, and so in that way he does become sort of a spiritual guide in a more ethereal, eternal way, you know, because humanity has always looked to the stars. So the Raven's prophecy makes him a light, you know what I mean, an actual lamp, which will recur again when we meet the Hermit, and I pulled the Hermit card from that deck. The Hierophant in the Shadowscapes is a tree, and I love that, you know what I mean. He's grown and been there for hundreds of years, so he knows what's been around. And in the Wild Unknown, he holds the key to something. And he's connected to a lot of other cards in that deck because of the lightning in him. So he's a fascinating character. He can be someone we resist, but he has a lot to say, and listening to him can be interesting as long as we are sure that he has the right intentions. One of the things about the majors or the keys is that they, you know, you could spend hours talking about them and not say anything, or, you know, say something suddenly very simple that says it all. It's so interesting. They are very context heavy to me too. I think it depends where they show up in the reading. So the lovers are a card that I traditionally do not like. I don't love seeing the lovers in a reading. I don't love most interpretations of the lovers. It may be my least favorite major arcana card. And I really had to search for cards that I kind of liked. The one that that I kind of like the most is the Prism of Visions here, and it's not super easy to see, but we get this sort of dance-like masquerade quality. Not necessarily adding more layers to the card for me, but I like the imagery in a way that I don't like most. Fountain, Prism of Visions, and Line Strider there, if you're curious. Even when I look at my journal, I've got about 2 lines for this card. I respond to the kind of old-fashioned Marseille-style definition or meaning of this card as choosing. And I think one reason why I don't mind the sort of biblical imagery in the Waitsmith is that the story of Adam and Eve in the garden is really all about choosing and influences and listening to influences. And there's a knowingness. And when Adam and Eve eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they can't unknow what they know now. They can't unsee what they see. So there is a loss of innocence and an opening of the eyes, and we can't go backwards. So choosing to know something, choosing to see something, choosing to learn something means that we can't ever unknow it. You know, we can't ever unlearn something. It's always there in us. In the way that my religious background, you know, I can't unknow that path. I don't necessarily respond to it anymore, but I know it. It's there, and it does impact almost everything I do, you know. So in that way, I think there's a knowledge, there's a revelation, there's a learning of things that can't be unlearned, and that's a choice to do that. It's a choice to leave the garden. It's a choice to leave the innocence of the first 5 cards behind you. In a way, it sort of immediately kisses the hierophant goodbye, because it says, you know, he's the one who's going to tell us not to eat from the tree, and now we're saying, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and eat from the tree. You know what I mean? And we move forward in the chariot, and it requires strength, and then it, you know, blah 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 down the line. So this is a turning point in the majors for me. Now, in readings, I tend to have pretty traditional interpretations of this, unless something like I just described seems really important. So, you know, I will say it means choice. It will mean an ethical choice. It can mean connections, relationships, states of innocence, states of ignorance, blissful ignorance, and just kind of general passion and enthusiasm. And then in its more shadow side, it can be making unethical choices, or deliberate choosing to remain ignorant, or an inability to choose, or just kind of faking interest, faking choices, faking care. So, you know, the Lovers is an interesting card in that way for me, because I don't get excited the way a lot of people do. Astrologically, this is associated with Gemini, and so there's a duality in this card that I think is interesting. And even sort of a split personality quality to it, that I think is interesting. And so it in itself can be both good and bad at the same time. And if we think about it in terms of just stereotypically falling in love, you know, falling in love feels great, and it also feels terrible. You know, I've never felt more mortal in my life and more fragile than when, you know, falling in love with somebody. So, you know, that, you know, yes, it feels great, and then it also feels terrible. So there is kind of this like duality in that card that I think is both interesting and difficult, and you know, it's fascinating in its way. So yeah, the Lovers. I know I'm in the minority here, but I don't get excited when I see this card showing up, because usually it means I'm going to have to face something or make a choice about something that I'd rather not deal with, and that's going to change the way I look at the world. So we're going to do the chariot, and then I'll pause this video and we'll do the next bunch. So I'll probably go like, I don't know, maybe strength through the tower. We'll see. Maybe temperance. The chariot is my birth card. I'm a 7. And so I should feel closer to this card than I do. But again, there have been few cards that have artistically depicted it in a way that I am drawn to. I'm actually drawn to the Prisma Visions one, if only because it reminds me of the movie Clue. But what this card really is about for me is about opposites being united into direction. So this is, this is a card of movement, sure, but it's hard for me to escape Coleman Smith's still static chariot. We absolutely are not always moving in the direction we want to be, and moving towards our goals is never easy, almost never easy. And in order to move this block of stone, which is life, sometimes we need to take opposing forces and wrestle them into submission and into direction. And so, a lot of the chariot for me is not necessarily about, yay, it's a chariot race, I'm moving fast. It's about, A, kind of wanting to stay still sometimes, and B, when you want to move, like knowing that it's not just getting in the car and turning the ignition. You know what I mean? This is a spiritual journey. This is a life journey. It involves taking these Jekyll and Hyde parts of ourselves and these yin and yang parts of life and like smashing them together and saying, move, obey me, go in the direction I'm telling you to. And sometimes they go in 2 different directions and it can rip the chariot in half. Sometimes they both decide to go in a direction that's not, one way or another, that's not the one you want. And every once in a while, you master the skill to get them moving in that direction. And so the chariot is not an easy card, even though it seems like on the surface it is. It requires a willpower, which is why I don't like when, despite the fact that I actually chose this card, I don't like when the chariot is a car. Because if it's a car, it's a car. It's a Flintstone car. You know what I mean? You're using your 2 feet to move it, and your 2 feet want to go in different ways. It's erratic, and it's not easy, and it's you got to crack the whip, and that doesn't always work. You have to bring together all of the forces, and that you're not given a guidebook. You got to figure it out as you go. So the chariot is a difficult card, in my opinion, and I mean, obviously that's tainted by my own life experience, but it is, you know what I mean? It's not easy. Like, it can be great, but where the magician is so beautiful because he manages to just sort of effortlessly become a conduit. The chariot is a more common experience in life, which is that, we got to bang the flints together in order to get the fuel, to get the fire burning. And then once the fire's burning, we got to make it stay lit. And then we've got to make the fire do something other than burn the wood. You know what I mean? So it's a very willful card. So in readings, I would say he does represent the ability to bring things together, to bring together opposing forces and push them toward a goal, to push through. He can facilitate movement. He can also be kind of, like in literature terms, a deus ex machina, a machine of the gods. The chariot that comes in at the end of Medea and carries her away, or whatever literary tradition you may remember that from. So he can be a machine that facilitates a resolution, and so in that way he can be a facilitator of movement. He can represent a race or a contest. There is a victory quality to this. You do hope the chariot wins at some point. And then in his shadow aspect, you get immobility, backward motion, right? The inability to control those forces and they tear it apart. The ability to move on or just really slow movement. Blocked movement, fear of movement, car trouble, So there's the chariot. So let's take a little major arcana intermission, and we'll come back for Act 1 of our show, Act 2 of our show, Act 2, little hourglass tip of the hat there. We'll come back for Act 2 in another video. So I'll talk to you very soon.